Taylor Walker from the Adelaide Crows, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Shannon Hurn from the West Coast Eagles.
This is Nathan Jones from the Melbourne Football Club.
Phil Davis from the GRS Giants.
It's Brad Avery from the Port Adelaide Football Club, and you're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hello, it's MJ. Welcome to another Coaches Panel podcast as we talk through and count down who I believe are the 50 most relevant players across all your fantasy football formats. And if you want to check out today's player in more detail, or yesterday's at number 50, you can check it out at coachespanel.tv. To help me chat through the player I've positioned at number 49, I got Benny Gogos on the line. Hello, mate. How are you?
Hey, mate. Very happy to be here. I'm excited to talk about the St Kilda ruckman.
Yeah, now I'll be honest about him. We'll go through some of his details and we'll talk about him. When I started kind of planning for the 50 most relevant in November, Billy wasn't really on the list hugely. Then there were some moves that happened in the trade period. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then when the prices came out, in probably two of the three formats, maybe not so much in another one, but in two of the three formats, I went, well, hello. All of a sudden, we have ourselves a very, very relevant player, and we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. We are talking Billy Longer in at number 49 of the 50 most relevant. There's some potential upside here. Previously top 10 draft pick a number of years ago. Previously at the Brisbane Lions, now he's made his way down to the Saints a few years ago. His highest score from 2018 in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team was 57. I know, yikes. But then let's talk about his highest Supercoach numbers for the year. 94. That ain't too bad. That was up against the Gold Coast Suns. His average last year in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team, 44.4, while in Supercoach it was 53.4. His Supercoach price for 2019, $260,900. His AFL Dream Team price for the year is $285,800. And then he's a little bit pricey in contrast. In AFL Fantasy is going to set you back $484,000. We're going to talk about rucks and structures and strategies for a whole chunk of the 2019 preseason, Benny. But depending on the structure you want to go with, if you don't want to lock away a set and forget combination, Billy Longer needs to be in your consideration.
Yep, and the primary reason that is the case, MJ, is because he is essentially the only ruckman on the St Kilda list. So if we look back to that trade period, you cut out for a second, so I'm not exactly sure if you said this or not, but Tom Hickey obviously got traded to West Coast.
Yeah.
And he went for very, very little. So St Kilda received pick 39 and a future fourth round selection for Tom. So what this kind of suggests to me in a roundabout way is that St Kilda really want to give Billy the chance to establish himself as the number one ruckman.
Yeah.
Now, he's played 6 seasons. So he started at the Lions, played 9 games there across his first 2 seasons as a young ruckman. That's, if anything, that's actually positive. Comes to St Kilda, first season plays 16 games, does fairly well. Again, just gets his 25 hit-outs a game, only 7 touches, but building nicely, picks up his 4 tackles, plays 18 next season, a bit of progression, gets a couple more touches, goes into 2017 after missing 2016, and actually starts to really develop as a tap ruckman, lifting his hit-outs to 38 per game. So, and then, of course, he has a very poor season last year. But what's interesting to me is that he's only 25. Yeah. So we don't exactly know what the territory for his potential is. Now, a guy that I thought about who, look, the likeness isn't that high, but I was just intrigued by the numbers. Ivan Marek, he played his first 6 seasons at Adelaide and never went above a 63 average. Suddenly became the number one ruckman at Richmond in 2012, and he averaged a 97. And look, he was essentially like an 80-plus ruckman from there on in. So I could definitely see something happening from Billy. In fact, the expected progression of a ruckman, or the time they're expected to really start progressing, is around 24, 25. So yeah. He's in a really good age. He's already got that history of the 38 hit-outs in 2017. And I just think, like, if he's picking up 35 hit-outs a game, it's kind of hard to see him not average 70, which is probably going to be good enough for Dream Team. He's had a history of averaging a little bit higher in Supercoach, so probably going to be good enough for Supercoach. I think AFL Fantasy, we can probably put a red line through his name already because of that price tag. But yeah, I just think there's a lot of positives, and I've been a little bit surprised just having a conversation with you just before that he's being ridiculed a little bit, because I think people are going to be seriously looking at him, given that there's a couple of options there in Brodie Grundy and Max Gawn that have got seriously large price tags, and Max especially has a history of injuries. You suspect that at some point in the season, one of those guys at the very least is going to be much cheaper. So I personally don't want to be spending top dollars on ruckman, just knowing that is a position that is very injury prone. So if I can look to someone cheaper in a guy like Billy Longer, that's certainly an avenue I'm willing to explore.
Yeah, it certainly is. You talk about that 2017 year where you averaged 78 across the formats. 17 games that year, Dream Team and AFL Fantasy, went over 80 on 8 occasions, including 4 tons with a peak of 125. Supercoach that year 7 times. He went north of 80. And 3 of those times he scored 110 or above. And again, you're right. If we focus just on the Supercoach and Dream Team component, he's got to be priced and thought about differently in AFL Fantasy, given he's pushing closer to that sort of 500,000 sort of marker. And that's what the 50 Most Relevant does. It tries to put Dream Team, Supercoach, and AFL Fantasy and create a universal list. So in some formats, if we were just doing a Supercoach 50 Most Relevant, he'd probably be higher, but because there's the AFL Fantasy component, we need to make them all in there. But in Dream Team and Supercoach, he's priced less than $50,000 more than first-year player Sam Walsh. And if you were to get a 70 from a first-year player over the opening 6 to 8 weeks, you would take that to the bank almost every single week. And Billy isn't a cash cow. He's just a little bit above that, but he's got a scoring history. And you did talk about those Saints' lack of competition. Now that Hickey's an Eagle, Rowan Marshall's, he's a better relief ruck option. He's more in a genre or style of Adelaide's Josh Jenkins, who plays key position forward, can ruck, but you probably don't want him rucking most of the game unless there's an injury that's happened. Lewis Pearce is developing okay in the VFL, and then Sam Alabakis is a former US college basketballer. He's still just learning his craft, so there is no competition for spots. He's priced in Dream Team and Supercoach a little above a cash cow. So he really is that pure stepping stone. And then I think you make a really interesting point when it comes to rucks, is that sometimes if you go set and forget, it can, now I know you can say it about every position, but it can burn you. For example, one of the most popular combinations to start with last year was Stephen Martin and Max Gawn. And that was because they were really popular, had plenty of price potential within them. But if your end of year combination wasn't Gawn and Grundy, then you were severely missing out. Like, for example, say you went Martin and Gawn, and the final 10 games of the year, if that was your combination as opposed to Grundy and Gawn, in AFL Fantasy, just in the last 10 weeks, you would have been behind just in those 2 spots, 285 points in AFL Fantasy, whereas it would have been 314 points worse off in Supercoach. That's a lot of points to be bleeding away in a position of the ground that you've only got 2 scoring variables to get right. I know, Ben, you can make it up in other lines, but just in those 2 spots, if you lock yourself into set and forget and get it wrong, gee, man, that can really burn you on the back end.
That's it, MJ. And the other thing that is a terrific stat that I believe was Tim's stat from a couple of seasons ago now is that no 2 ruckmen from the previous season have actually maintained their status as the top 2 in the next.
Yeah.
So it's just, look, we've got 2 outstanding ruckmen now. We've got Gawn and Grundy, who are quite clearly just phenoms of the game. It would be a surprise if they weren't to be the top 2 rucks. But again, I just want to make that point that ruckmen, given the very nature of the way that they play, they are going to get physically a little bit more bashed up than the regular player. So there's a little bit of an increased expectation of injury there. And when we're paying such big prices, I just think like, look, who do I want, Max Gawn or someone like a Tom Mitchell or, even a Josh Kelly, someone who I think is going to average 110. I'd probably side with the midfielder and just think, look, I'll take the risk that, potentially something that happens to Max, maybe an early injury or even to Brody or something. I think there's probably an increased likelihood of that. And on the flip side, you've got someone like Longer who really we don't know the full potential of this guy. So I was just looking back through the history, and St Kilda traded pick 25 and pick 41 for Billy and pick 48. So 25 is a lot of value. They really did. They really believed in Billy, and I suspect there has been no serious reason why they would have dropped their expectations. As I said, like AFL Ruckman, majority of them are going to get a lot better from 25 to 30 than what they were from 18 to 25. And Billy's hitting a really, really nice age right now. And we have quite a history of Ruckman that looked pathetic. There was question marks over why they should be in the AFL. And a year later, suddenly they are the Messiah.
Yeah.
And look, I would be very surprised, but I can definitely see Billy having a great year and everyone thinking a lot highly of him in 12 months' time than they do now.
Yeah, and the thing that adds on top of that for Billy Longer is there is an unknown, and maybe it's jumping at shadows in January, but there is an unknown about how Melbourne are going to structure up with Hogan out of the side. I know they've got Wiedemann and McDonald, but there has been some talk, or at least heavy desire, from Braden Preuss to want to play in the same side as Max. Now, whether or not that happens, it could purely just be jumping at shadows, which a fantasy football coach would never, ever do. But there is an unknown possibility of the impact, if Preuss does play, on what happens to Max Gawn. And so, by going a set and forget of Grundy and Gawn, are they likely to be the top two rucks? Possibly. But by getting a Billy Longer, you hedge your bets a little bit, you generate some cash, you see a little bit of what's happening in the fantasy football world, because as you've mentioned, the top two rucks historically aren't always the same two year in, year out. And you could build a case for Todd Goldstein that he could do that. We saw him bounce back last year, and it was only just a handful of years ago he was probably the number one ruck. Sam Jacobs was injury impacted last year and has proven to be one of the most consistent and durable rucks going around. Stephen Martin, when he's not ruck sharing, he's 110 ruckman. Matthew Cruiser just 2 years ago got his body right and delivered massive scores. Even a Toby Nankervis. I have a suspicion that these new ruck rules play to a ruckman like him who can compete in the hit-outs, but it's his work around the ground and his tackle pressure and his body work. I think the new ruck rules could impact him. So you could build a case that it's not a lock of Gawn and Grundy 1 and 2. You can build a case that there's 4 or 5 other guys that could push their way up into the mix.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think people that have closed themselves to the idea of something altering either haven't played the game long enough or are being a little bit closed-minded. Like the reality is we don't know. We're so far out from the season starting. We don't know. There are so many variables. Like you make a great observation with the Braden Preuss stuff. Like there has to be a serious thought that he has come to the club on the proviso that they're saying the plan is to play you and Gawn together. Now, whether that comes to be true, you suspect it's unlikely, but I do suspect that at the start of the season, they're going to probably play him because, you have to at least fulfill your obligations at the beginning, and it's just going to throw a spanner in the works. There's so many different permutations. Things very, very rarely stay constant from year to year. We even know in 2017, obviously, Max Gawn went down early with a knee injury, so... Yeah. Just getting up, that happened in round 3. Started the season on fire. Got injured in round 3. Something like that could easily happen. We know injuries happen. We have to plan for all potential outcomes. And I just think with this current situation, if you've got a guy that you're like, look, he has no pressure on his role. He's priced at 45 in Dream Team and similarly in the Supercoach. and he has he has averaged 78 only one season prior, and he should be entering his prime now.
Yeah.
And he was highly rated as a youngster. There's a lot of things to like about him. On the flip side, look, he hasn't exactly shown it year on year, but at the end of the day, when we're paying such a low price, we can easily move out of him if something goes terribly wrong. So I really think that Billy Longer is someone that's got to be seriously looked at by the general public heading into 2019.
You're right. Look, worst case scenario, if Longer fails to score well, which let's classify that as 65 or below, then he just becomes your first priority upgrade target. And that's perfectly okay. Best case scenario, he gives you a great look for 5 to 8 weeks at the best ruckman bubbling away for who you believe will be a top 2 ruck that you haven't got on. And then he scores you 70, 75, 78 and above, knocks out a couple of hundreds, which he's shown he's got the potential to do. And he makes you some money, gives you a look to make sure you can lock in the right premium ruck option as much as the information you have at that point. So I think there's only massive upside for coaches not going set and forget strategy at this point in the preseason. And I think Longer for Dream Team and Super Coach right now is probably the best R2 option going around if you're not going for a set and forget, which I think at this stage is a mistake.
Yeah, it's proving to be a very exciting early season. Now, obviously, we're gonna have a lot of injuries between now and round one, but there's a heap of mid prices that are presenting themselves, and you've seriously got to be considering a lot of them. I think it's the first season where I can seriously name quite a number of players on each line that I would have relative confidence in are going to increase in value. So it's a really exciting season. I think Billy Longer is certainly one of those blokes, MJ.
Yeah, no, look, he's locked away currently for me for Supercoach and Dream Team, and I'm not a closed door to it in AFL fantasy, but he's far from a lock in there. When it comes to drafts, both seasonal and keepers, ruck rankings are always really intriguing because if there's ever a ruck rush that happens, coaches, depending on the experience level and how long you've got to make your selection, coaches can panic and go and get all these rucks. Long as someone that he's going to be there late in the draft. Now, if you have 2 rucks on ground, that may not be as likely, but if you've just got the one ruckman on field, I'm not opposed to both in keeper or seasonal drafts. You'll probably get Billy really, really late. Ideal, you don't want him as your on-field ruck. You'd want him as your emergency. But look, he's number 1 ruck, no competition, should score relatively well. You'll take that from a bench ruck with a late draft pick. And again, in either a seasonal or in a keeper league, I think even in drafts, there's some relevancy for Billy Longer.
Yeah, I agree. I think, look, you wouldn't want him on field, but in saying that, if you've managed to absolutely stack the midfield or done something else, as a very low selection on-field player, you know, you could do a lot worse than him. I believe. My expectation is he probably does a 70-plus average.
Yeah.
At this early stage, lots of things can change, obviously. And given that that's the case, you know, you're probably going to get that from your last defender anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
The value on the rucks is always going to be super high. Like you said, there's a potential for there to just be heaps of rucks go at once. We've seen it time and time again, even though it's a little bit nonsensical. So I think that, he's certainly a guy that you, even from my perspective, I'd love to have him as a second ruck. That would be the perfect scenario.
Exactly.
Get him late. You've got a guy that's number 1 ruck for his team, and all things considered, he's going to be great backup. But yeah, he's an exciting option, MJ. I think a few guys will be surprised by the name we're throwing out today, but he's going to be right in the mix come round 1, I believe.
Yeah, I certainly think so, man. Hey, appreciate your thoughts today on Billy Longer.
Thank you, MJ.
If you want to go and check out the article for Billy Longer or any other player in the 50 most relevant, you can do that at coachespanel.tv. You can join our Patreon at patreon.com/coachespanel. And depending on the level you jump in at, you can get 24 hours early access, just like Robert Boylan has done. He is a part of our Patreon, and thank you, Robert, for playing your part. You can keep checking out at coachespanel.tv every single day for new articles and the podcast, just like you're getting this, a new one every single day till we wrap up our 50 most relevant. In at number 48 tomorrow, a guy that, I'll be honest, I had him early in my top 20, but he slid just over the past 2 weeks, and there's a big reason for it.